guys, I'm Tommy and today I'm going to be talking about some samples that I made out of sounds that were recorded in space. So typically I script out my videos a little bit, and this one's going to be completely unscripted, so I'm just going to go through some of these samples and talk about them. If you want to hear the complete little interlude that was made from this, I'll leave a timestamp here. And the first sample that I want to talk about is something that I made out of the sound of a spacesuit losing pressure, which is something I never really thought about how they have to pressurize, but apparently it sounds like this. So what I ended up doing to this sound was I EQ'd it to just get rid of most of the highs and boost the lows. I ran it through a multi-band saturator, and I really only did anything to this band. And even then, it's not a lot. I just wanted to give it a little bit more warmth. This multi-band compression and expansion looks a lot fancier than it is. It's just me expanding the low end and really highly compressing the high end, so much so that I'm shocked that there aren't more artifacts in the sound. And then I use my favorite default FL Studio plugin ever, the Transient Processor, to just give it as much attack and as little release as possible. And then I would end up doing that again after running it through the Sound Toys Decapitator, which, man, people talk so much shit on this, but personally, I really enjoy it. It's really good for when you just need to saturate something in, like, a highly destructive way. I have fixed the lighting a little bit. So to show you the before and after of what this sound started as and then became, I'll turn these off again. And then with all of these back on, I've got, actually, yeah. You have this, it kind of sounds like a mildly saturated 808 that's like gliding down in pitch. And what this ended up becoming was this. So the next sample that I flipped from this pack is the sound of turning on a spacesuit, which sounds like this. And I turned it into a kick. And the first phase was just by cutting out this little transient bit right here. And then without the effects on it, it sounds like this. And with the effects, it sounds like that. And that was just the first step. I would end up running it through these pretty much twice. And so first I'll show you what these do. I have a very nu metal scoop with the EQ. When you're doing sample flipping, you kind of have to throw all mixing conventions out of the window. And this is a really good example of that. Originally, I was going to try to give it the same kind of like fixed pitch that you would hear in a really heavy dubstep snare, where there's one fundamental that is just ringing out like this. And then, you know, layering like white noise over it to give it the snare-y sound. But I ended up going with this because all that I wanted was clarity on top and more of a hit on the bottom. And that hit was really boosted by the transient processor here. And you can see that I was just trying to give it more attack, not too much, but what I really cared about was just killing the tail of the sound. And I cared so much about it that I did it again. And after that, we have a plate reverb. If anybody's ever looking for reverb plugins, all you need is the Valhalla pack. It's some of the best plugins I've ever used. And one of the only plugins better is Virtual Mix Rec. It's like a legitimate, just, it's magic. It just makes things sound better, especially this Revival EQ. Like, just hearing this with and without it, there's a little bit of clarity that I've been A-Bing constantly. It shows a lot more on things with a ton of high-end content, strings, vocals, the sorts, but for some reason, I can't seem to replicate Revival here, and I don't know why. I don't know what it does, but it's become pretty important to my mixdown process. And what this sound ended up becoming as I ran it through the EQ more and more was this. Ooh, my CPU really doesn't like that. So the next of Colonel Chris Hadfield's samples that I decided to make something out of was, he said it was something to do with a dining table in the SoundCloud title. I don't know what he was doing with the dining table, but it was these noises. And especially that last one there and the first one had something about them that sounded like it would have been really, really beneficial for percussion, and especially in the context of being a snare. So the samples that came out of this, they clip a lot, like an exceptional amount. And when I consolidated them, what I had to do was just turn them down wildly and then turn up the audio clip after. And that's another one of those mixing conventions that's really useful to just throw out when you're doing sound design. If clipping sounds good, let it clip. And this first sample here, this is it without effects. Just a little bit of a click. And then with effects. And this is where I kind of got that metallic snare that I was aiming for with the past samples. I have almost the same signal chain on here, the same EQ, slightly different settings on the transient processor, just more attack and not slaughtering the release as hard. This is my most overused plugin too. It is called Little Alter Boy, and it is a pitch informant shifter where you can separately alter the pitch informant. It also has pretty good drive, but not as good as things like FabFilter Saturn. But this formant shifting here is super, super important to this sound. It takes it from being this, not necessarily tinny, but this certainly annoying because of the high-end sound, and makes it much more palatable. After the formant shifting, we have Valhalla Plate again. Virtual Mix Rack again. Like I said, you can see that I've been reusing some of these signal chains. And then another high boost with a cut that probably isn't doing much. It's in a range most humans aren't really going to be able to hear, or at least hear very well. But the point of this sample specifically was just to be a really aggressive, bright snare. And the one beneath it has a very different purpose. It is just a kick. Not really a fancy one, despite all of the plugins that I managed to use on it. But this is how it started. And we see the shared signal chain again, the same type of EQ. We're going to see identical transient processing to the last snare. We're going to see that the formant is down by, oh my, an extra tenth. And I'm sure Plate has the same settings. VMR probably does as well. Where this sample is different is right here. So multiband compression and expansion is one of the most slept on but incredibly important tools in my opinion, not just for sound design but also for mixing. I put this on every bus of every mix that I do. So the last plugin on that signal chain is a compressor with damn near default settings. It still does a pretty good job. I just needed a little bit of compression on it. And the next sample uses the same exact mixer channel and therefore the same exact signal chain. And it is a snare made out of a slightly different part of the sample. Hear how atrociously it's clipping. It's a little bit of a nightmare when you're doing sound design, just to try to keep all of the volumes and gain levels and the source stage down to a low enough area to where you aren't going to bake clipping in when you consolidate a sample, but honestly, if it comes out well, it's all that counts. So this next sample is the one that had the least done to it. It was just the sound of a bottle hitting something. And I just turned it into a bell. Pretty simple. It was my all-time favorite plugin, Little Alter Boy, just formant shifting it up a little bit. And then the Oh, slightly more plate than I've been giving the other sounds, but not much more. And then without effects, you can hear it. And the next sample is one that I put a lot of work into. It started out with another sound of a spacesuit's pressure equalizing. And I knew that I wanted a bass, or at least something like melodic. And what it became, at least at first, was this. And the way that I did this is by isolating just one sine wave from it. And this is probably the most important technique that somebody can have for really dramatically flipping samples. Because if you can break something down into sine waves, you can recompose pretty much anything else out of it. And what I did was I put a bell really dramatically up, 30 decibels up right here on C2. I'm off by a cent though. And then I just high and low passed around it. And I got it pretty well isolated. The interesting part of this has more to do with what I did with it later. So, this was actually a separate branch that I did from the equalization sample, where I got it loud enough to peak, and that was actually on purpose, right here. Man, if I ever saw this, I would hope it was on purpose. I have another approximately 30 decibel bell going up with kind of fake band passing around it. And the point of this was, do you hear when it clips like horribly and it kind of sounds like Morse code coming through? It sounds like these little beeps that are coming through in like a serial transmission or something, and it doesn't really make sense what it's saying or the pattern or anything, but that's also kind of the point. So what I ended up doing was I didn't use the really clippy version for Ambience, but keeping this pitched up one, where the only difference is that I'm isolating C5 now. I'm flat by 17 cents, but that's fine. What I ended up getting out was this. Not super special, really interesting dynamics to it, actually. Like, if you really get up on the waveform, you can see there's not a lot of pattern to it. And then I did something really interesting here with the effects. So here's the dry sample. Here's the wet one. And other than the reverb that actually, this is a different reverb. I used a room just so it was slightly more spacious. But what I did here was some patcher magic, where I have 8 separate copies of Little Altar Boy pitch shifting, and 2 volume controllers, and then a script that is just inverting the input. So let me break this down a little bit. Let's just look at the top chain first, and we can see that we've got one where the pitch is the same, but I moved the formant down just to give it a little bit more body. And then 3 others where the pitch and formant are shifted up. 3, 7, and 9 semitones. And then on the bottom, I have the formant shifted down as well. And then I have this up by 4, 7, and 10 semitones. So what this is going to do is kind of forcefully create a minor 7th up here on top, and then a major 7th down here on bottom. And then these 2 instances of Fruity Send are just keeping track of the volume. When I move the dry knob here, I can either mute or enable these. And then to automate that, what I've done is create a knob here. I have that knob directly controlling the dry signal up here on the top chain. And then for the bottom one, I needed it to be inverted. So I just had Fruity Formula Controller do 1 minus the A input, and then hook that knob up to A, and then output into this Fruity Sends dry level. And this came out in a really interesting way. Um, Man, running this is going to be really bad for the camera's frame rate. But, okay, let me just run what I need to show this. So, this top envelope here is just automating the volume, and then this bottom one is moving the knob. And so the knob, when it is turned from left to right, or as the envelope will show from the bottom to the top, it goes from major to minor, and then the other way. And the thing that I really, really enjoy about this is the fact that when it's moving, while the sound is playing, you can actually hear it change from major to minor or minor to major. That's not something that you can get out of most instruments. It's something that's really obviously digital, and a lot of people want to try to make these things sound organic. But I think that there's something really beautiful in the contrast of having these really bizarrely organic dynamics in the sample, and then doing things that are just blatantly impossible to do with truly organic sounds. So the last thing that I'm going to be showing you in this video is a very strange technique for making highly staccato noise samples. What I did was I took all of the percussion that I had made, the kicks, the snares, all of that, and I chopped them up into, man, I don't even remember what this was. I think like a 30-second of a bar. And I just started dragging them around kind of wildly. I found where transients went up and down and tried to shape it so that with reverb on it, it would come out with sort of an up and down feel. You know, the point of this is for it to sound like people are snapping and hitting things all around you in different areas. And so the original cuts came out to this. Wow, that is really not coming through while I'm recording. For some reason, when I'm recording, my CPU is almost completely busy. And I'll just show you what the sound came out as when it was consolidated. And then to make it sound all around you, I automated the panning just wildly. And I stumbled upon something kind of interesting here, which is automating the panning of a reverb tail. So if we look specifically, like, I'm pointing as if you can see where my finger's aiming. If you look specifically right here, and then right here, we have two examples of it. So this hits, and it pans a little bit, and then this hits, and it pans a little bit, and you've got it really dramatically far to the right as this transient here hits. And almost immediately, the panning is set to the left, and then exponentially increasing towards the right. And if I loop this, I'm sure there's some degree of psychoacoustics going on, or, you know, something related to the Haas effect, but it sounds really, really strange. And I think that the reason it sounds so strange is that we're taking a mono room sound. And typically, room sounds are things that we hear in stereo. And, you know, most reverbs, at least most good ones, also output in stereo. And what we're doing is we're taking the signal, we're monoizing it, and then we're panning it, not even like linearly, you know, as if you're, the mic's over here, you know, as if you're turning, or, you know, something that could possibly happen physically. The only thing that could make this sound happen in real life, I guess, would be an incredibly sudden and unfortunate bout of hearing loss. But whatever it is, I really enjoy it. And I don't know if I've heard anyone in the IDM or glitch community, or really anybody, panning reverb tails yet, so let's see what it can do in the future. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I hope you learned something.